My wife, the one I swore to love and protect, left me for another man's fortune. A man whose only virtue was the power to buy everything that money could achieve, including the fidelity of the woman I once called mine. I watched her go, seduced by the promises of a life of luxury and glitter, while I was left behind, shrouded in the shadows of a shattered love. She didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. For her, I was the past that she abandoned, without thinking about the marks she left on my heart. Time passed. She, now beside her rich lover, lived surrounded by everything she ever wanted. Or at least, that's what she believed. Because fate has a cruel way of exposing the truths we try to hide, and the truth she would later discover would be bitter as poison. The man who won her, who took her away from me, would exchange her for someone else as quickly as he had won her. And then, there, in that cold, empty mansion, she finally understood the value of everything she had left behind. But regret came too late. Her lover left her with nothing, without love, without protection, and with a secret that now weighed on her like a curse. Pregnant and alone, her new reality was one of fear and despair. There was no more luxury, there was no more security. She found herself lost, not knowing who to turn to. But there was one person she knew she could turn to for help, the only person who could understand the depth of her pain, me. But could I, betrayed and humiliated, reach out to the one who destroyed my life? Or would this be the moment for revenge? Can love survive the deepest of resentments, or will fate have an even crueler end in store for her? There are secrets she hasn't discovered yet, and decisions that could change everything. How far does forgiveness go? And what's left of a life built on lies and regret? Only time will reveal whether this cycle of betrayal and revenge can be broken, or whether the shadows of the past are too strong to be dispelled. Los Angeles was a city of contrasts, where the brightness of the night lights hid the deepest shadows. In the midst of urban chaos, where every corner told a story of success or failure, there lived Michael Thompson, a respected businessman, whose life seemed perfect in everyone's eyes. Married for over a decade with Laura, a woman of stunning beauty and magnetic presence, Michael believed she had built a solid family, worthy of admiration. Together they had a young daughter, Sophie, to whom Michael dedicated all his love and attention. The girl was the light in his eyes, and he would do anything to ensure her happiness. Michael was a man dedicated to his work, but, above all, to his family. From the beginning of his marriage, he struggled to build a stable future, both financially and emotionally. He was always there for the important moments, striving to balance the pressure of his job with the need to be a present father and husband. His business, a growing consulting firm, demanded a lot of his time, but he never let that keep him away from Laura and Sophie. Laura, in turn, was an ambitious woman, raised in a middle-class family, where she learned to value luxury and sophistication. Although she had loved Michael at first, the glow of love began to fade as the years passed and routine set in. The comfortable life they led was not enough to satisfy their desire for something more, something greater. She longed for luxurious travel, haute couture clothing, and a lifestyle that Michael, despite his success, could not provide in the way she desired. It was during one of these social trips that Laura met Richard Pierce, a millionaire investor, owner of a vast fortune and a charismatic personality that attracted everyone around him. Richard was Michael's opposite in many ways, adventurous, exuberant, and, above all, willing to spend large sums of money to impress. For Laura, Richard represented everything she missed in her marriage: excitement, luxury, and the promise of a life without limits. Over time, Richard and Laura began to meet frequently. What started as a harmless friendship soon turned into something deeper. Richard enchanted Laura with extravagant dinners, expensive jewelry, and the promise of a future full of adventure and luxury. She knew she was crossing a dangerous line, but the desire to escape her seemingly banal life was stronger than any sense of guilt she might feel. Meanwhile, Michael remained oblivious to the subtle changes in Laura's attitude. He was too busy dealing with his company's challenges to notice that the distance between them was growing. Sophie, although too young to understand what was happening, felt the tension between her parents and, in her innocent way, tried to bring them closer together with her small gestures of love. The decisive moment came on a cold winter night, when Laura finally decided that she could no longer live a divided life. Michael had arrived late from work, exhausted but happy to be able to spend time with his family. He didn't immediately notice the seriousness in Laura's eyes until she called him into the living room for a chat. Sitting in a leather armchair that he had bought especially for her, Laura, with her hands shaking and her eyes avoiding contact, began to talk about what she felt. She explained that she wasn't happy, that the spark in her marriage had faded, and that she needed something more to feel alive again. Michael, still trying to understand what was happening, tried to argue, talk about the importance of family, about how much he loved her and how much he was willing to do to make things work. But Laura had already made her decision. She confessed that she was involved with Richard and that she had decided to leave Michael to live with him. Michael was stunned, unable to process the betrayal that had just been revealed. Laura left the house that night, leaving Michael alone in a house that suddenly felt cold and empty. He stood frozen in the middle of the living room, unable to believe what had just happened. Sophie was sleeping upstairs, oblivious to the devastation that had befallen her family. Michael's world fell apart in that instant, and he felt a hole opening inside him, an emptiness that he didn't know how to fill. The days that followed were of complete disorientation for Michael. He found himself caught between the duty of maintaining normalcy for Sophie and the crushing pain of betrayal. His friends tried to comfort him, saying that time would heal everything, but he knew that the scar from that wound would never completely disappear. Michael began to avoid places and people that reminded him of Laura, sinking deeper into work as a way to escape the painful reality that was now his life. Meanwhile, Laura immersed herself in her new lifestyle alongside Richard. At first, everything seemed perfect: luxurious parties, exotic trips, a life of glamour that she had always wanted. But slowly, Laura began to realize that not everything was as she imagined. Richard was a demanding and possessive man, who treated her more like a conquest than a partner. The fun conversations from before began to disappear, replaced by orders and criticism. Life with Richard, which once seemed like a fulfilled fantasy, began to turn into a golden nightmare. Months passed, and the loneliness that Laura felt with Richard began to eat away at her soul. She remembered Michael, his kindness, his unconditional love, and the home they had once shared. But now it was too late. She was trapped in a life she had chosen, and there was no going back. Michael, on the other hand, slowly began to get back on his feet. He began to focus on his daughter, ensuring that Sophie did not suffer due to her mother's absence. Work became his escape valve, and he was able to turn pain into fuel for success. But deep down, Michael knew that the wound left by Laura would never completely heal. Los Angeles continued its frenetic routine, indifferent to the drama unfolding in Michael and Laura's lives. Amid the brightness of the lights and the incessant noise of the city, two souls were moving further and further away from what once was true love. And as Michael tried to rebuild his life from the rubble of betrayal, Laura began to understand the real price of her choices. The story was far from over, and reality, always relentless, still held many surprises for both of them. Life in Los Angeles went on, indifferent to the suffering and choices of its inhabitants. As Michael continued to rebuild himself, Laura became increasingly trapped in her new reality. The initial sparkle of her life with Richard was gone, replaced by a cold, controlling routine. Richard, who had once treated her like a rare jewel, now saw her as property, and Laura began to realize that she had traded genuine love for an illusion. The parties and trips that used to dazzle her began to become empty, meaningless. Richard's company, which was initially exciting, became a burden. He was impatient, distant and, on many occasions, cruel in his words and attitudes. Laura felt the weight of unfulfilled expectations, but she could not admit to herself, much less to others, that she had made an irreparable mistake. The money that once seemed like the solution to all his problems now couldn't fill the void in his heart. She missed her old life, her home with Michael, and most of all, her daughter, Sophie. The memories of the little girl running around the house, of her laughter and hugs, haunted Laura in the quiet moments. But pride prevented her from going back, from admitting that she had abandoned everything for something superficial. Meanwhile, Michael dedicated himself even more to his work, achieving success after success in his career. His business prospered, and he became increasingly respected in the business world. However, professional success did not erase the pain of betrayal. He kept an impassive face in public, but at night, when he found himself alone in his home, the emptiness became unbearable. Sophie was his only source of joy, and he held on to that with all his might. Laura's sporadic encounters with Sophie, under Richard's watch, were painful for both of them. Sophie, still very young, didn't understand why her mother was no longer present, and Laura felt the distance between them grow with each visit. Richard, in turn, made a point of keeping Laura busy, keeping her as far away as possible from any thoughts about the past. But he couldn't control everything. The turning point for Laura came one rainy morning, when she began to feel an uneasiness that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. After a visit to the doctor, she received news that took her by surprise: she was pregnant. At first, the revelation brought a mix of emotions, fear, anxiety and, for a brief moment, a spark of hope. Maybe a child could bring some meaning to her life, a chance to start over. But when she told Richard the news, his reaction was anything but what she expected. He was furious, accusing her of trying to hold him to a responsibility he did not want. For Richard, the idea of having a child was an inconvenience, an unnecessary complication in his planned life. He made it clear that he was not willing to be a father and, even worse, suggested that Laura should consider solving the problem as soon as possible. Desperate and without support, Laura found herself in a cruel dilemma. The man for whom he had abandoned his life, his family, now refused to take responsibility for a child. She was completely alone, scared and lost. And it was at that moment that she began to reconsider her choices. The loneliness and coldness that surrounded her began to suffocate her, and Laura realized that the glamour that had seduced her was nothing more than a facade. Richard became even more distant and, before long, began spending more nights away, supposedly for work. Laura knew this meant only one thing: he had found someone new. History was repeating itself, but now she was the victim of her own decision. The pain of being rejected, not only as a wife but also as a mother, consumed her. Regret, which had once been a shadow in the background, was now in full light, clear and merciless. Laura tried, in vain, to get closer to Michael. She knew he was the only person who could understand her, who could offer some kind of comfort or at least listen to her. She started sending messages, calling, looking for contact, an opportunity to apologize and, who knows, ask for help. But Michael, hurt and aware of the motivations behind these attempts, remained distant. He couldn't allow her to touch his open wounds again. The pregnancy progressed, and with it, Laura's anguish. She could no longer count on Richard, who avoided her at all costs. Alone and desperate, Laura began to consider possibilities she had never imagined. What would you do? How could you face this situation without anyone by your side? Regret gnawed at every thought, every memory of what he had left behind. Michael, on the other hand, was beginning to recover emotionally. Time and dedication to her daughter helped ease the pain. He was stronger, more determined to move forward. But Laura's ghost still hovered over him, and Sophie, although still innocent, asked questions he didn't know how to answer. What would you say to her when you found out the truth? The tension between the characters intensified, and the choices made in the past began to take their toll. Laura, isolated and aimless, faced the reality of her decisions. And Michael, without even knowing it, was about to be faced with a situation that would test his strength and character in ways he never imagined. Their paths were about to cross again, and the consequences would be inevitable. The days in Los Angeles were sunny, but for Laura, each ray of sunlight seemed like a cruel irony amid the storm unfolding in her life. The pregnancy was advancing, and Richard's silence was deafening. He now avoided her completely, spending more time outside the house and only returning when he knew Laura was already asleep. There were no more parties, no more extravagant dinners or luxurious trips. Everything that Laura thought was the pinnacle of life had dissipated like a mirage, and what was left was emptiness, a loneliness that she had never experienced before. It was on one of these lonely nights that Laura, sitting on the porch of the huge house she shared with Richard, decided that she could no longer go on like this. She found herself looking at the horizon, where the city lights twinkled in the distance, reminding her of the home she once had with Michael and Sophie. Regret was constant, but there was something deeper, a need to face the consequences of his actions and try, in some way, to correct the course his life had taken. Laura knew she needed to talk to Michael. Not just for her own peace of mind, but also for Sophie, who deserved to know what was happening, deserved a chance to understand why her mother had walked away. But most of all, Laura needed to admit to herself that, despite everything, Michael was the only one who could help her now. Taking courage, she called Michael. The sound of the prolonged ringing seemed to echo in his chest, each second increasing his anxiety. When Michael finally answered, there was a coldness in his voice that made Laura hesitate for a moment. He didn't say anything right away, waiting for her to explain the reason for the contact. "Michael," Laura's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now, but I need to talk to you. It's not about us, I know there's nothing between us anymore, but it's important. It's about Sophie." On the other end of the line, Michael remained silent for a moment. Sophie's name was the only one capable of penetrating the wall he had built around himself. Even without wanting to, he felt obligated to listen to what Laura had to say. "I'm listening, Laura," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. Laura took a deep breath, fighting the emotion that threatened to take over her voice. I'm pregnant, Michael. And I have no one to turn to. Richard doesn't want this child, he abandoned me." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Michael felt the weight of the revelation, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to hang up the phone, cut any ties that might still exist between them. But another part, a part that still cared about what was left of her family, couldn't just ignore what Laura was going through. "And what do you expect from me, Laura?" Michael asked, his voice filled with a mix of anger and repressed compassion. "After everything, do you think I can?" Laura interrupted, unable to contain her emotion. "I know I don't deserve anything from you, Michael. I know I destroyed our family, but, please, I'm not asking for myself. I don't want to go back into your life. But Sophie, she deserves a chance to meet her brother, and I don't know what to do. I'm alone, and scared. I need your help." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the sharp pain of remembering everything that had happened. He wanted to refuse, he wanted to send her away and tell her that she was reaping what she sowed. But the thought of Sophie, innocent and oblivious to all this, made him reconsider. How could he let this child, his half-brother, suffer the consequences of Laura's choices? "We need to talk in person," Michael said finally, his voice softer. "Come to my house tomorrow. We need to resolve this in a way that's best for Sophie, and the baby." Laura felt immediate relief, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of fear. She knew that facing Michael face to face would be difficult, but it was something she needed to do. She thanked him with a lump in her throat and hung up, feeling a mix of fear and hope that hadn't left her since the beginning of her lonely journey. The next day, Laura arrived at the house that was once her home. Every step to the door felt like a confrontation with the past. She hesitated for a moment before knocking, and when Michael opened the door, she realized how much he had changed. He was stronger, more determined, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes that she knew was her responsibility. "Come in," he said, without much ceremony, but also without hostility. Laura entered, smelling the familiar smell of the house she had abandoned, and for a moment, a feeling of nostalgia enveloped her. They sat in the living room, facing each other. Michael watched Laura for a moment, trying to understand what she really wanted. Even though there was still deep hurt, he couldn't deny that there was something different about Laura now, a vulnerability he had never seen before. "What do you intend to do, Laura?" Michael asked, breaking the silence. Laura, with shaking hands, looked down before responding. I want this baby to have a chance at a life, Michael. I know I made terrible mistakes, but I don't want him to pay for it. I don't want Sophie to grow up without knowing her brother. But I can't do this alone." Michael remained silent for a moment, processing Laura's words. He knew that the decision he made at that moment would affect their lives forever. "What about Richard?" Michael asked, his voice filled with a bitterness he couldn't hide. "Is he just going to get away with all this? Are you going to continue your life as if nothing had happened?" Laura felt tears start to form, but she fought them back. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she also knew she needed to do something for the future. He's already moved on, Michael. He left me alone to deal with all of this. I know it doesn't change what I did, but," she looked at Michael, hoping to see some compassion in his eyes. "But please, help me give this child a chance, help me do the right thing, just once." Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision. He knew Sophie deserved the truth, but he also knew that his own peace depended on how he handled this situation. He stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the garden he had tended so lovingly over the years. "Laura, this is not easy for me. But I will help you, for Sophie, and for this child. But Richard needs to pay for this. He can't just escape the consequences." Laura nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. She knew there was a lot to be resolved, but at least for now she had Michael's support. And that, at that moment, was all she could ask for. Over the next few days, the tension between Laura and Michael was palpable, but they both knew they needed to focus on what was most important, Sophie and their unborn child. Michael, determined to do the right thing, began planning his next steps. He knew that a confrontation with Richard was inevitable, but he also knew that he needed to protect his family. Michael, determined to resolve the situation fairly, sought out a lawyer to discuss the legal implications of the situation. He wanted to ensure that Richard took responsibility, both financial and moral, for what he had done. The lawyer suggested that Michael and Laura confront Richard together, showing him that they could not be ignored. Laura, on the other hand, was nervous about facing Richard again. She knew he was a powerful and ruthless man, and she feared what he might do. However, Michael's presence by her side gave her a strength she thought she had lost. Finally, the day of confrontation arrived. Richard, who until then had ignored all of Laura's attempts to contact him, finally agreed to meet them at one of their offices in downtown Los Angeles. When they arrived, Richard was sitting behind a luxurious desk, a cynical smile on his face. He looked at Laura with contempt and at Michael with indifference. "So, have you finally decided to bring your puppy back, Laura?" Richard said, his voice full of sarcasm. Michael remained calm, but the insult did not go unnoticed. He stepped forward, placing himself between Laura and Richard. "We're here to settle this once and for all, Richard," Michael said, his voice firm. "You can't just run away from your responsibilities. Laura is pregnant, and this child is yours. You will assume the consequences." Richard laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Consequences?" He got up, walking to the window overlooking the city. "I don't have time to play family man. Laura knew from the beginning that I wasn't interested in any of this. She made her choice, and now she's going to have to live with it." Laura felt Richard's words like a direct blow to her heart. She wanted to scream, she wanted to cry, but she knew it was no use. She had made a mistake trusting him, and now she was paying the price. "Richard," Laura finally found her voice, trying to remain calm, "this child is your responsibility too. You can't just turn your back. I made a bad choice by leaving Michael, but I can't do it alone. I need you to do your part. Richard turned to her, eyes narrowed. My share. He walked toward her, each word dripping with contempt. My part was to give you what you always wanted, Laura, money, luxury, a life of excess. But you wanted more, and now you're stuck with it. Don't try to involve me in this, because I won't fall into that trap. Michael, seeing Laura's emotional state deteriorate, intervened again. It's not just about you, Richard. You can try to avoid your responsibilities, but there are legal consequences for what you are doing. We are not asking for a favor, we are demanding what is fair. Richard stared at Michael for a long moment, his smile slowly fading. He knew Michael was right, but his selfish and arrogant nature prevented him from giving in easily. And what exactly do you intend to do, Michael? Sue me? Take me to court? He shrugged. You know as well as I do that this could take years and, in the end, you will only get crumbs. I am untouchable. But Michael was prepared for this. He knew Richard was powerful, but he also knew he had something more valuable, the truth. He wasn't there to be intimidated. Richard, you can continue to hide behind your money, but this child will be born, and everyone will know the truth about what you did. This will ruin your reputation, and you know it. We're not here to negotiate, we're here to make sure you do the right thing. The silence that followed was tense. Richard knew he was cornered. He had power, but he also had a reputation to maintain, and scandals like this could ruin everything he had worked for. Finally, he sighed, a sound of frustration and resignation. Very well, he said, returning to his desk and picking up a document. I will provide the financial support you want, but don't expect me to be involved in any other way. I don't want to see this child, I don't want to know anything about him. Understood? Laura nodded, feeling relieved and at the same time crushed by Richard's cold treatment of the situation. She knew that, in some ways, this was the best possible resolution, but that didn't make things any less painful. Michael also nodded, knowing that this was the only way to guarantee a future for the baby and, at the same time, protect Sophie from the impact of this scandal. They left Richard's office in silence, knowing that although this chapter was closed, the repercussions would continue for a long time. As they walked through the busy streets of Los Angeles, Laura felt a sudden rush of gratitude for Michael. He could have refused to help her, he could have walked away and left her to face everything alone, but he didn't. He chose to do the right thing, not for her, but for Sophie and the unborn child. The days following the confrontation brought a sense of relief mixed with harsh reality. Michael knew there was still a lot to be resolved, but for now, he could find some peace, knowing he had done everything he could to protect his family. Laura, in turn, began to accept that although the past couldn't be changed, she still had a chance to do something right. The future was still uncertain, but she knew that, somehow, she could find redemption alongside her daughter and the baby to come. She finally understood the true meaning of responsibility and unconditional love, something she had wasted before but was now determined to regain. And as the Los Angeles sun set over the city, Michael and Laura's lives moved forward, marked by the choices they made, but also by the hope of a new beginning. After the confrontation in Richard's office, a heavy stillness has settled into Michael and Laura's lives. Although the agreement had been reached and Richard had agreed to provide financial support for the baby, the emotions surrounding this decision did not go away easily. The weight of what had happened continued to press down on them, leaving both Michael and Laura with a feeling of uncertainty about what would come next. Michael, in particular, found himself faced with a moral dilemma he didn't expect. He had decided to help Laura for Sophie and the unborn child, but now that the deal had been made, he wondered how involved he should be. Laura was vulnerable, and despite everything that had happened, he couldn't help but feel empathy for her. But at the same time, the pain of betrayal was still fresh in his mind, and the idea of allowing Laura to get close again scared him. Meanwhile, Laura struggled with her own internal conflicts. She knew she had made bad decisions, but now she found herself in a position where she had to face the consequences head-on. The loneliness she felt in Richard's house was oppressive, and the thought of raising the baby alone terrified her. But at the same time, she was hesitant to ask Michael for more help. She had already asked so much, had already taken advantage of his compassion, and now any further step seemed like an abuse of his kindness. Sophie, despite still being too young to understand the full complexity of what was happening around her, began to realize that things were changing. She saw her mother more often, but these visits were fraught with tension, and Michael's presence, although always caring, was tinged with a new gravity. Sophie, in her innocence, began to ask questions that neither of them knew how to answer. "Daddy, why is Mommy sad?" Sophie asked one night as Michael put her to sleep. Michael looked at his daughter, her big innocent eyes looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He hesitated for a moment, not knowing exactly how to explain the situation. "Mommy is going through a difficult time, dear," he replied softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "But we are here to help you. Everything will be fine." Sophie seemed to accept the answer, but Michael knew that the simplicity of that explanation was not enough. The truth was much more complex, and he didn't know how long he could keep Sophie shielded from reality. There was a part of Michael that feared the impact this situation would have on her when she was older and could understand what had really happened. As the weeks went by, Laura began visiting Michael and Sophie more frequently, seeking a kind of normalcy amid the chaos her life had become. She tried to be strong, tried to be firm in front of Sophie, but inside, uncertainty was eating at her. Each visit to Michael's house was a reminder of what she had lost, and each time she returned to Richard's empty house, the regret consumed her even more. But it was in Michael that the biggest dilemma unfolded. He found himself torn between the desire to protect Sophie and the baby, and the fear of being hurt by Laura again. He knew he was getting more involved than he should have, but he felt like he had no choice. Laura's life had become a burden he wasn't sure he could carry, but at the same time, abandoning someone in need seemed to go against everything he believed in. The situation became even more complicated when Laura, during one of these visits, finally spoke about the future. She, for the first time, began to consider what she would do after the baby was born. Although she was grateful for Michael's help, she knew she couldn't continue to depend on him indefinitely. But the fear of facing the world alone was paralyzing. "Michael, I'm thinking about going back to my hometown, after the baby is born," Laura confessed one night, while Sophie played in the backyard. "I can't keep leaning on you forever, and maybe it's better that way, for all of us." Michael was silent for a long time, absorbing her words. Part of him knew this would be for the best, a way to finally put an end to this whole story. But another part, the part that still cared, made him hesitate. "Laura, you don't need to decide this now. Let's wait for the baby to be born, and then we'll see what's best. But know that you will always have a place here if you need it." He looked into her eyes, trying to convey the sincerity of his words. Laura smiled, a sad but grateful smile. She knew things would never be the same between them, but Michael's kindness was something she would always be grateful for. Michael's moral dilemma was clear: should he allow Laura to resume her life far away, perhaps finding her own redemption, or should he keep her close, for the sake of Sophie and the baby, knowing that this could reopen wounds he had been trying to overcome? Heal. And Laura, in turn, faced the difficult decision of abandoning what little stability she had found, in exchange for a life of uncertainty elsewhere. Their dilemma was an impasse with no easy solution, a reflection of the complex webs of regret, duty, and love that now bound them together. The decision that each one would make in the days that followed could change the course of their lives forever, and this uncertainty hovered over them, awaiting the moment when destiny would finally reveal itself. The months passed like a silent hurricane, and soon Laura gave birth to a boy, Ethan. Ethan's birth brought a new dynamic to the lives of everyone involved. Laura, for the first time in a long time, felt genuine joy as she held her son in her arms. Ethan's innocent look brought renewed hope, but also a painful certainty that she would need to make a definitive decision about her future. Michael, upon seeing Ethan for the first time, was overcome by a whirlwind of emotions. The baby, small and vulnerable, represented an unbreakable bond between him and Laura, but also a constant reminder of betrayal and past mistakes. Sophie, on the other hand, was delighted with her little brother. She, with her childish innocence, only saw the beauty of having a new member in the family, without understanding the complexities that involved the adults around her. Laura, aware that her presence was becoming a source of tension for Michael, decided it was time to leave. She knew she couldn't continue living under the same roof, reliving the guilt and regret every day. As much as I wanted to stay close to Michael and Sophie, I understood that their departure was necessary so that everyone could move on. She chose a cold morning to break the news. As Michael drank his coffee in the kitchen, Laura approached silently, with Ethan in her arms. There was a weight in her eyes that Michael noticed immediately. "Michael," she began, her voice firm but soft, "I've decided it's time to leave. I know this is what's best for all of us. I can't stay here, I can't keep bringing you these painful memories. I need to start again, far from here." Michael looked at her, feeling a tightness in his chest. He knew this moment would come, but the reality of Laura leaving was harder than he imagined. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Are you sure, Laura?" he asked, his voice controlled but with a hint of concern. "You don't need to leave so quickly. We can find a way to deal with this together." Laura shook her head, her gaze fixed on the baby. "I need it, Michael. I need to start over, and so do you. I know it won't be easy, but this is the only way we can give Ethan and Sophie a chance to have a life without all this pain we carry." She handed Ethan to Michael to hold. As she did so, her eyes filled with tears, but she kept her voice firm. "You were good to me, Michael. More than I deserved. And I will be forever grateful for that." Laura paused, taking a deep breath. "But now, it's time for me to find my way, without dragging you along." Michael held Ethan in his arms and looked at Laura with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. He knew that, as painful as it was, Laura was right. Time does not erase scars, but it can offer a new beginning. The next morning, Laura left, taking Ethan with her. She returned to her hometown, where she began to build a new life, far from the luxury of Los Angeles and the wounds of the past. Despite the difficulties, she found strength in Ethan, determined to create an environment of love and stability for him, something she had learned the hard way. Michael remained in Los Angeles, dedicating himself to Sophie in his work, but with a new perspective on life. He had lost a lot, but he had also gained a clarity he never had before. Sophie grew up happy and healthy, and Michael made sure she knew how much she was loved. He didn't close his heart to the possibility of new love, but he knew that time was needed to heal all the wounds. As for Richard, his fate was sealed by his own arrogance. The scandal surrounding his paternity and the way he treated Laura reached the media's ears, and soon his reputation began to crumble. He was forced to abandon his prominent position in Los Angeles social circles, and his once booming business began to crumble as his partners withdrew. He found himself alone, stripped of the power and prestige he once took for granted. In the end, each of the characters followed different paths, marked by the choices they made and the consequences of those choices. Michael found a new peace with Sophie, while Laura, in her hometown, began to build a real life, learning to value the simple and genuine things she previously ignored. Richard, on the other hand, reaped what he sowed, watching his fortune and influence slip through his fingers like sand. And so, the cycle of betrayal, regret and redemption came full circle, leaving everyone with the scars of the past, but also with hope for a future where they could finally find peace and purpose.